and welcome to Author Talk with me, LG Thompson. Now, the concept behind Author Talk is that on Tuesdays I'll be answering some of the questions that authors very often get asked by readers, and on Fridays I'll be sharing some of my favourite books with you. Today is a question day, and the question I'm going to be discussing today is, what is dangerous writing? Now, before I get to that, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. When I'm at writing events, I very often explain that it took me 10 years to write Modernist Dreams Brutalist Nightmares. That wasn't 10 years of sitting physically writing, it was like 10 years to actually get to the heart of the matter. The book is about my experience of being part of the first generation to grow up in Cumbernauld, which was the most experimental and ambitious of Scotland's new towns. These were part of the response to the housing crisis following the Second World War. Glasgow, where I was born, had suffered a lot of bombing during the war, and of the houses that remained, an awful lot of them were in slum conditions. So they built these new towns where people had indoor bathrooms and running water and bedrooms, and instead of entire families basically living in one-room houses with outside toilets, shared communal toilets. But what really made Cumbernauld very different was the concept behind it. Like, there was a town centre built. It was a mega structure built in a hill in the middle of the town, and all the neighbourhoods of the town were built round about it. All paths led there, and everything that you could need, all of your social needs. So there was the health centre was there, the dentist was there, the library was there, there was office buildings, there were even flats in the centre called the penthouse flats, which always seemed unbearably glamorous to me. And then there were all the shopping needs of the town were there as well. There were pubs. Cumbernauld Town Centre was Britain's first indoor shopping mall. And when Cumbernauld was designed, it was constructed in such a way that nobody ever had to cross a road. So there were no traffic lights in Cumbernauld. Everything was dealt with by roundabouts, and for pedestrians, you either had bridges to cross or underpasses to go through. And I think actually, all the houses were built with parking spaces, so they were thinking ahead. Even although the first people moved in the 1950s, which was way before ordinary normal people had cars, they were sort of thinking ahead. The planners were really thinking ahead. So Britain's first indoor shopping mall, because of the road system, it became the safest town in Britain because nobody ever had to cross a road, therefore pedestrians did not get knocked over. And the other kind of really big fact about it was that when I moved there, 1/3 of the population was under the age of 15. So the place was just absolutely coaching with kids. So it was really quite an interesting place to grow up. I don't think I really appreciated it that much as a child. When you're a child, you're just where you are, and that's it. It was actually a really, really interesting place to grow up. I mean, you could just go out into the street. There was no such thing as play dates in those days. We were free range. You get put out the house in the morning, and there would be somebody out there to play with. You'd roam around and find somebody and go off and have your adventures, and just wait until somebody told you, your dad's looking for you, your mum's looking for you, or your ma, or your da. And you knew it was time to go home and get your dinner. So there was a lot of freedom around it. And it was an interesting place to grow up in. I mean, the town even had its own artist in residence. I think for a long time I didn't really think about Cumbernauld or growing up there because it was a new town. I'd always had this sort of idea that it wasn't a real place, that I'd grown up somewhere that wasn't actually real. I didn't really think about it. I was always kind of moving around. I spent a lot of time moving around Scotland, living in different places. This isn't something I've actually considered before, but I'm now thinking that moving to Ullapool might have been part of the trigger of me wanting to write about Cumbernauld. I spent the years from, I left home at the age of 17, left Cumbernauld to go to Dundee to go to art school. And then after that, spent quite a bit of time just moving around Scotland, living in different places. I've lived in islands and lived in cities, but I've never really felt particularly settled. I moved to the Highlands at the back end of 1998. That's when I met my husband, Charlie. And 13 years later, we moved to Ullapool. So we arrived in Ullapool in 2011. We'd actually come south, although to most people, Ullapool's quite far north. It was south to where we were living before, about an hour's drive south. And it was the first time that I'd felt at home in a place. And I felt that I could put down roots. It was the first time I'd felt settled. We moved here in 2011. I joined a local writing group. And in 2012, I started writing about Cumbernauld for the first time. And I'm just wondering now if it was because I was feeling settled in a place that I felt that I belonged, that I felt then able to sort of go back and start exploring that. So my first attempts at what eventually became Modernist Dreams Brutalist Nightmares were just a few short stories about things that had happened, and I made them quite funny. Like, I did make a few attempts at going into some of the horrible things that happened. Like, I think I wrote about being bullied quite early on and kind of like flipped that in its head and sort of laughed about it. That was quite an empowering thing. And then eventually I decided that I wanted to write the book. I came up with the title quite early on, and I made a few attempts at writing it. But every time I tried to get into it, it wasn't working. The whole thing wasn't working. I mean, I managed to kind of put a book together. But the one thing that I didn't want to write about was actually what was at the heart of the whole thing, which was the trauma I endured, which was childhood sexual abuse. And so at first I tried to ignore that and write around it, and the book didn't work. It didn't work because it wasn't true. And then I tried to contain what had happened in one single chapter and just box it off and keep it there. And that didn't work either, because the people that were involved were actually the people that perpetuated the abuse, were involved in our lives in a very deep and complex way. And they weren't contained in one chapter. They were everywhere. Their tendrils went out all over the place. So while I was kind of battling with this and not wanting to write about these things, but still having the urge to write the book, I came across a guy called Tom Spanbauer. Now, the reason I came across him was because I'd been reading a lot of work by Chuck Palahniuk, and then I started reading a bit about Chuck Palahniuk, and he talks about Tom Spanbauer, who was an author. He died in 2024. He was an author, but he was also, he ran these, what sounded like really extraordinary writing groups, and Chuck Palahniuk went to these writing groups. I kept reading more and more and more about them, and one of the things I read about was this idea of dangerous writing, which was pioneered by Tom Spanbauer. And this is how he defined it. Dangerous writing is writing what personally scares or embarrasses the author in order to explore and artistically express those fears honestly. And you know how sometimes you just come across something and it just clicks with you? And that clicked with me, this dangerous writing thing. And I thought, well, I'm embarrassed and scared to write about these things that happened to me. But in order to move on, in order for this book to work, in order for me to be able to explore and express myself, I was just going to have to delve right into it. So I made myself some rules about writing the book. Quite a few of those rules were heavily influenced by Tom Spanbauer. I mean, one of the things he says somewhere else is about if you're going to write the truth, you have to write the absolute truth. That became quite an empowering thing, because I just absolutely stripped everything away then. I thought, right, I can't skirt around this. I can't avoid it. It's at the heart of the matter. And so then I just decided to face it head on, and I just launched into it. And the whole thing was very, 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 very freeing for me. People have called me very brave for writing this book and the the subsequent book, Bitter Fruit. I mean, I don't know about that bravery thing. I mean, I did have a wobble before the book came out, before Modernist Dreams Brutalist Nightmares came out, about exposing myself, but I don't think I thought about it in these terms. In fact, I know I didn't think about it in these terms when I was writing the books. But really what I was doing was trying to fix myself. What I was trying to do was explore and artistically express my fears. And a really good way into that was, for me, was this dark humour, this gallows humour, which comes quite naturally to me. So the whole idea of this dangerous writing was very, very, very important to me. It gave me a way into these books. It gives me a way into exploring what happened to me. Gave me a way into a perspective and an understanding that this was a legitimate thing to do. And it's quite funny. Like, I mean, you know, everybody, like, obviously the talking about the sexual abuse was a big thing, and talking about it so directly. But there's a lot of other things in Modernist Dreams Brutalist Nightmares that I actually found quite excruciating to write about. Things that possibly, you know, that would just bypass other people. They would read it and go, well, that's just a funny little story. In some ways, just as difficult, and maybe even more difficult than writing about the abuse. It's like very strange. I'll give you a little example here. So this is from a chapter called Sticks and Stones, and it's about my reaction to a one-time childhood friend, like the boy that's mentioned here, Basher. I think when he was when we were about 6 or 7, we hung about, we used to play and get on our bikes and have wee adventures and things. But this is a wee bit later on. I think we're in our early teens by this time, and life had changed. We were no longer friends. He lived just along the road from me, and like I don't think by this point I don't think we'd talk to each other for years. You know, we would pass each other on the street and you would just ignore each other. Those kind of weird things that happen. Anyway, this is what happened. I was in my neighbour's porch, knocking on their door. They were out, and I was about to go home when Basher happened by. He must have been walking around with pockets full of stones, hoping to chance upon a victim, and here I was. He started chucking the stones at me, but this time I was half a head taller than him, and had fear not turned my bones to jelly, I could easily have barged past him. Instead, I pivoted this way and that as he pelted stone after stone, snorting with laughter as I went, "Aya, aya, aya," over and over. To make matters worse, a girl who lived directly across the road had spotted the action and made no attempt to hide her gleeful laughter as she watched from her bedroom window. After what felt like an eon of humiliation, Basher ran out of missiles and just kind of sauntered off while I fled home, thoroughly ashamed of my feartiness. I mean, that's just like a little daft story. I actually found that really, really embarrassing to write. Shame is such a powerful emotion. And like, I felt shame when that happened, like shame that I didn't stand up for myself, shame that the event was, you know, witnessed by this other girl, like shame that like both of them were just kind of laughing at me, and like that I just made a victim of myself. And that was the emotion that was with it. So like writing it, and actually when I wrote it, and I thought, well, it was just like a silly little thing, but it had this kind of, it held a power over me. And I just remember kind of doing the aya, aya, aya. It's just absolutely crazy. Writing, I think, helps to take some of that power away, and like I no longer have that feeling of shame attached to that incident. I just think, well, I was just a kid and I just didn't know any better. The dangerous writing, the idea of the dangerous writing gave me a way into like what we would maybe call sort of like big major trauma, something that's impacted my entire life. So there we have it. Dangerous writing, pioneered by Tom Spanbauer, is writing what personally scares or embarrasses the author in order to explore and artistically express those fears honestly. It's a good way of getting rid of that embarrassment, I think, turning it into something else. It's empowering. Thank you for tuning in to Author Talk with me, LG Thompson. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you've got any questions you'd like to ask, please just add them to the comments. And I'll see if I can get around to answering them at some point. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Author Talk. Spring, summer, autumn or winter, it was never not the season for being hit by something, and sometimes that something was a chair. One day it was a chair that was thrown from a terrace in school. One of its metal legs crash landed in the skull of a boy I knew who was into Frank Zappa. He was carted off to hospital. We didn't really do sympathy in the 1970s, and empathy was unheard of. So when he returned several days later with a big white bandage around his head, he was henceforth known as Pope Penis the First.